have a really a good time. So thank you so much. And last two Sundays ago was the 9th of Av. And on the 9th of Av, it was still the fast at, this is my time, 7:30. I know for some of you it's later, but for me at 7:30, it was still the fast. And we can't, there's only very certain portions of Torah we're allowed to study on the fast day. So that knocked off this class. And then last Sunday, I had the joy of being by my son in Springfield, Illinois. My son is the Chabad rabbi, the emissary in Springfield, Illinois. And he had a dedication of a Torah scroll that was actually written in memory of my father-in-law, blessed memory. That was very, very meaningful, special event. So that's where I was last Sunday. And now we're home, and now we're learning. So what were we talking about? Well, we had begun this topic the Sunday before I left, meaning the last Sunday that we were still, I didn't leave. I was just last weekend I was gone. That's not the right way to phrase it. The last Sunday we were together, I think it was Christelle's fault. I think she was the one that wanted to understand about Jewish books. Yes, Christelle, are you the guilty party? I think so. So in her honor, hi Dixie. In her honor, I did some research to give you a real understanding of the transference over the generations of really writing down Torah. So we went through a lot of information that a lot of Jews don't know, including Orthodox Jews, because it's very, subject specific. And you can be an Orthodox Jew and not know anything I taught you last time, but it's very interesting. And it gives you, I think, an understanding of this idea of the value and the preciousness of the Jewish books that we can now easily access, written or online format, but where did it all come from? So we explained, I'll just give sort of an overview of last time, quickly to remind ourselves, because it was 3 weeks ago, and then we'll continue today. So we explained that all of Torah literature is divided into what's called the written Torah and the oral Torah. And the written Torah was meant to be written down, and the oral Torah was not meant to be written down. And the written Torah, of course, is the 5 books of Moses. That is part of the written Torah. And then all the prophets and all the writings, all of that, those 24 volumes are what we call, this isn't working, 24 volumes are what we call the written Torah. And that written Torah meaning this is God's word that's meant to be written down. And it's very, very high level of God's energy, the highest, of course, in the 5 books of Moses, and then a little bit less in the prophets and a little bit less than that in the writings. But all 24 volumes are very, very, very sacred, and every word is very precise, and every word is directly from God. And then we have all the explanation on that, which we call the oral Torah, which we explained is something that was originally not allowed to be written down because God's word is very holy, and coming down into a physical, crass world and something as physical as paper, parchment, ink, quill, pen, computer, whatever it is, that's like way too physical for this. So all of that part of Torah was not meant to be written down in that format. It was really supposed to be just transmitted orally from generation to generation. And that worked for thousands of years. And it worked because the people committed themselves to reviewing and reviewing and reviewing their lessons so many times. In the times of the Talmud, the average, nothing special, just average student reviewed everything 100 times. So he was a walking Torah scroll. He was a walking repository of all the treasures of Torah. But there came a point in time in Jewish history where the Jews couldn't do it anymore. This was after the destruction of the Second Temple, and the Roman persecution was very, very, very intense. And as such, they didn't have the space. the inner space to just review and review and review and be these walking Torah scrolls. And at that point, we said there was a fear that the Torah would be forgotten, the oral Torah would be forgotten, because we're not writing it down because it's too holy to write down, but we don't have the ability to absorb it and retain it. So what's going to happen to it? At which point, the leader of world Jewry, Judah the prince, said, in such a situation, we're supposed to write it down as briefly as possible. Because we don't really want to write it down, but we have to write it down because otherwise it's going to be forgotten completely. And we said that was the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the first work written as cryptically as possible. It has 6 sections. It is the foundation of the law needed to lead a life serving God, to lead a life practicing the commandments. And we said this was written approximately in the year 200. That was the first time something is really written down. Roughly at the same time, we have the foundational esoteric work called the Zohar. The Zohar is a foundational work of Kabbalah. And that was also written about the same time, roughly the same time. So we have the Mishnah, which is the legal work explaining how we are supposed to live our lives and serve God. And we have the Zohar with all the Kabbalistic esoteric understanding. And these are really the first 2 written works. Then we also said around this time, we have all the Midrashim. We said there are 2 types of Midrashim, the Midrash, which is the homiletical explanations, filling in all the gaps in the storylines. And we have the legal Midrashim, which are pulling out from the verses all these different learnings and nuances of laws. So something could be explained in the Midrash and the legal Midrash, and the same thing is explained in the Mishnah, because they're both about law. But in the Midrash, it's explained much more extensively, much more elaborately. We're explaining how the sages derived the law from the verse and what in the verse caused them to derive that law, as versus in the Mishnah, where we just say bottom line, the law. That's why the Mishnah is much more cryptic. And these legal Midrashim were written very close to the time of the Mishnah, like we'd say the 3rd century. So from around 200 to about 300. Just a little bit after the Mishnah, very similar to the Mishnah, giving the laws like the Mishnah, but unlike, we said it's not cryptic, instead it's really showing the why, how the laws are derived from the verses of Torah. That's the legal part of the Midrash. And then we have the Midrashic Agada, which is the storyline, and that was really compiled over a period of 800 years. From beginning of the year 200. In other words, once the Mishnah was printed, it opened up the gates for everything else. We have the Mishnah, right on its heels the Zohar. We have the Mishnah, the Zohar, and the legal Midrash. Mishnah, Zohar, legal Midrash, and now we begin writing down the Agadata, the storyline Midrash, which spanned over 800 years. From the year 200 to the year 1000, all of the storyline of all the written Torah is written down. Now, again, it's not that then it was originated. Just as the Mishnah's laws weren't originated then, just as Kabbalah wasn't originated then, just as the Midrashic legal understanding wasn't originated then, none of it was originated then. This is all going back to Moses and Mount Sinai. But now suddenly we're writing down, so all of these foundational works are being written down. We said everything here is with the divine spirit. None of these, we said, was just written by very religious, very saintly, very wise, very godly people. They were all of the above, but they were also writing with the divine spirit. And we said, and this we haven't gotten to, but we're going to get to it today, that that's sort of our cutoff line, that all Jewish religious writings up to the 2 demarcation line are 2 very famous, as we're going to discuss today, legal authorities called the Taz and the Shach. And the Shach died in 1663. So everything up to and including that Taz and Shach, which means till about 1663, everything written, not just 5 books of Moses, not just the writings, not just the prophets, everything in the Midrash, everything in the Mishnah, everything in the Talmud, everything in the Zohar, and everything else until the year 1663, we know for sure is written with the divine spirit. Everything. Doesn't mean they didn't use their minds, but what came through their minds was pure divine spirit. And again, these Taz and Shach are two very influential explainers of the law. We call it halachic legal commentaries. They're really explaining the law very influentially. And they, sorry, I don't know why this is not working. I don't know why. Weird. That password in 1663, everything there, even though the sages might have used their minds and probably did use their minds to understand, but when it came, they did their parts. What came through their mind was a divine spirit. So everything until then, we rely on absolutely, unquestionably, because we know it's not just a brilliant and godly mind. It's a divine spirit flowing through their mind. After the Taz and Shach, after 1663, then it depends. It could be a combination of the divine spirit and human intellect, which is how we would view a book like the Tanya. It could be just human intellect, very godly person, very brilliant person, but still just regular human intellect. Or it could be higher, and it could be God's spirit melding with the human intellect. So I'm not going to review everything we said. I'm just trying to give enough of an overview that today makes sense. So then we said, basically, we went through the details, but the basic next big jump in Jewish writing was what's called the Gemara. And Mishnah, the first original codification of Jewish law, plus Gemara, which tries to understand the Mishnah, together, Mishnah plus Gemara is what we call the Talmud, of which we said we have two. We have the Babylonian Talmud, which is much more extensive, and we explained why. And we have the Jerusalem Talmud, which is much shorter. As we explained both historically, in Jerusalem, there was a lot of Roman persecution. They didn't have the luxury of being able to explain like the sages in Babylonia did, that were living in a relatively peaceful and prosperous time for the Jewish people. And also explained spiritually how they were in Jerusalem, so they saw the light right away. They got to the point right away. Well, in Babylonia, they had to like search through the darkness to discover the light. And that went on for a very, very long time, because basically at this point in history, people were like, we don't understand the Mishnah. We don't know what it's saying. We still don't know if our chicken's kosher or not. We still don't know how you're properly supposed to ritually slaughter. We still don't know how to write a kosher mezuzah. We don't know if this tefillin are kosher or not. We don't know how to pray. We don't know how to serve you, God. It's all written in the Mishnah, but we don't understand it. So for that, we need all the back and forth argumentation and explanation of the Talmud, and primarily the Babylonian Talmud, to clarify for us. And the Babylonian Talmud was completed around the year 500. But then for like another 100 years, the sages after that worked on making it clearer and clearer and clearer and clearer. So that was from like the year 500 to 600. The next set of rabbis, and then we had the next set of rabbis, the Gaonim, we said from about 589 to 1038. So roughly we had the rabbis of the Mishnah from 0 to 200, from the Gemara from 200 to 500. The next rabbi is called the Sforaim from 500 to 600, and then the Gaonim from roughly 600 to 1038. After them, we have the rabbis that we call the Rishonim from 1070 till 1500, and then from 1500 until today, the rabbis are called the Acharonim. Acharonim, Rishonim means the first, Acharonim means the later rabbis. So these are the later rabbis. Unlike in the secular worldview, where as generations progress, they get higher and higher, we look at it like the closer you were to Mount Sinai, the holier you are, and the more authentic is what you're transmitting. So anything that came before us, we revere as like coming before us, and therefore being that much closer to Mount Sinai and the original revelation then of the Torah. And again, as we said, so first the Mishnah worked, then it didn't work anymore. The brains were too small. We didn't understand the Cliff Notes version of the law. And then we had the Talmud, which was developed over hundreds of years, 300 plus another 100, so it's like some 400 years to try to clarify it. And that worked for a while. And then we said it didn't work anymore because our brains were too small for us to understand it. Claims were too small. Exile was too tough under a lot of Christian persecution. So we just like didn't have the clarity of mind to understand it. Also Islamic persecution, depending on where the people lived. But it was always Christian persecution. Sometimes, occasionally, it was also Islamic persecution. And we said there were 3 rabbis that worked to clarify the Talmud and make it what we would call user-friendly. And that is what we were up to. So I just sort of did a fastish review, because before we could teach new, I want to sort of remember where we're up to. So before I begin, any questions? Okay. So now for those that were like not as closely following the review, to remind you. So we are at this point in history where the Jews are basically supposed to function and live their lives and know how to serve God from a Talmud. I don't know if any of you have been privy to seeing a Talmud. I mean, Danielle's been to my house, but I've ever pointed out to her. It's many volumes, big volumes, not like this size volumes, like this size volumes, many volumes. Definitely takes up a whole bookshelf, and it has to be a high bookshelf because they're very tall.
I have a copy of the Talmud. I have the Talmud.
You have a volume.
I have them all.
You have them all.
I have
okay.
80.
So it fills up a big size bookshelf, right?
It's four levels on a 2.5 foot wide bookshelf.
Okay. It's a Talmud. It's a lot to look through to find out if your chicken's kosher, or to find out if your garment's permissible or not permissible, and how you check it if there's a combination of wool and linen, and which combinations are okay and which are not okay, and what's okay and what's not okay. Or was that considered gossip, or was that okay? Or on the Sabbath, if there's a spill and you carefully clean it up with the napkin and you didn't squeeze and you didn't rip, was that okay or not? Or is it okay? Or can I do it or not? I mean, that'll be a lot to look through. So it's all in the Talmud, but it's not organized in a way that makes for easy finding of the law if we're looking at this as something I'm supposed to live. If I'm looking at this theoretical study, it's very interesting. It's fascinating. And there are many scholars of all faiths that are fascinated by the brilliance of the Talmud, by the philosophical brilliance, by the sharp intellect, by the analysis, by the synthesis. It's brilliant. But bottom line, for the Jews, they want to know how to live as Jews. They weren't like saying, wow, this is really cool. It's so beautiful that I could search through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages till I figure out if my chicken's kosher or if I'm allowed to do this on Sabbath. I just want to know what I'm supposed to do, how I'm supposed to live my life. So at this point, historically, the Talmud wasn't working for the Jews to know on the moment how they're supposed to live as Jews, which is, of course, originally the function of it. And it worked for hundreds of years. But then it just stopped working because the exile was too harsh, and therefore the minds were too small, and the people couldn't study with the inner peace to really absorb all these intricacies. So we needed an easier way to handle it. And we have 3 separate rabbis, each one working independently, that each recognized this problem, and each one tried in his own way to codify the Talmud to make it as user-friendly as possible. Now, you might not think any of their codifications are user-friendly because, I mean, we're very spoiled. We're in a very disposable society where we just say, Google, and boom, we get an answer. So we've lost the art of inquiry and the art of study. But putting it in perspective, they made it a lot more user-friendly. The first rabbi to do this was named Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac Alfassi. He's known by his abbreviation, Rabbi Isaac, which is Yitzhak, so you have the Y sound, Alfassi. So he's called the Rif. He lived from 1013 to 1103. So again, remembering our historical timeline, the Talmud was closed in 500, and then we spent the next sage just spent like another 100 years, like, tightening it up a bit. So it really is done 600. Now we're about 500 years later. 500 years more into exile, 500 years where the Jews are far more scattered than they were in the times of the Talmud. Basically, the Jews are in Babylonia or they're in Israel. Most are in Babylonia. So they're very centralized there. Babylonia was very prosperous most of the time. It was an easier life where the government didn't harm us most of the time. So the people could really focus on study. At this point, 500 years later, Jews are scattered all over the world. There's tremendous, tremendous persecution that they're battling every single day of their lives. And therefore, it's very hard. Like the exile is very harsh, and therefore the minds get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's very hard to know how to function as a Jew from a Talmud. So this Rabbi Yitzhak Alfassi, he said, Jews can't survive from a Talmud. So he took from the Talmud, he tried to glean the laws from the Talmud, and he wrote a work called the Book of Laws, in Hebrew, Sefer HaHalachot. And he said, listen, from this book of laws, you can study and figure out what you're supposed to do, because from the Talmud, there's so many argumentation and back and forth and so much going on there besides the laws. You know, it's pages and pages, so you find the law. Here, you just have the laws. That was a big step forward. And then came this huge, huge, huge giant, one of the greatest sages of all times, whose name you've probably heard of, one of the most famous rabbis of all times, called Maimonides. Maimonides' mind was so brilliant that it's hard to even fathom how brilliant Maimonides truly was. Maimonides lives from 1135, it's disputed, either 1135 or 1138, until 1204. So you see, he was directly following the Rif. Remember, the Rif passed away in 1103, and he's born like some 30 years later, 1135, 1138. And of course, the Rif's work has been published, but it still wasn't super user-friendly, because he structured it basically along the lines of the Talmud. So it was hard for people, again, when you just want to know, am I allowed to do this or not allowed to do this? Am I supposed to do this or not supposed to do this? Do I have to do this or do I not have to do this? It wasn't like an easy, open, and find exactly what you're looking for. It wasn't organized in a way that people could easily find the information they needed. It was just laws, but it wasn't organized as well. So Maimonides said, we have to do something completely different, because the Rif basically followed the structure of the Talmud. And Maimonides said, we got to restructure the whole thing. And what he did with his mind, which is unbelievable, I mean, even with a computer it would be unbelievable, but this was without any computer, is he not only pulled out every single law from the entire Talmud, but then, like, so to speak, looking at all these laws, he organized them independently, nothing to do with the structure of the Talmud, in the most user-friendly structure possible, a completely new structure. He made up his own structure, very, very systematic. So if you want to find out if your chicken's kosher, you know exactly where to look. And in the beginning, it gives you exactly what's going to be, and it's chapters, and within each chapter is the laws, and it's written in a very clear way. So it is so structured that you should literally, Maimonides writes, Maimonides called his work Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah means second to the Torah. And Maimonides writes in his introduction that I'm calling this second to the Torah because this is it. Have your Torah, you know, your written Torah, or your 5 books of Moses, or and the prophets and the writings, and this, you're good to go. Everything you need to know to serve God is here. Now, here is not here. Here is here. This was 14 volumes. Again, you could get them in teensy tiny print, and it's like this. That print's really tiny. If you actually want to be able to read it, it's more like this, because it's literally 14 volumes. But in those 14 volumes, everything is codified. And he only writes the law and nothing else. He cuts all the argumentation out. He doesn't quote anybody. You have no clue which rabbi said it. He's just writing the bottom line law. And this was just such an amazing accomplishment because it literally made it that you opened up wherever you need to open up, you knew exactly where to open up, and you can skim a few pages and find the law. Know exactly how God wants to be served. Now, again, this is an unbelievable accomplishment. He was the foremost intellectual figure of the Middle Ages, of medieval Judaism. And here, as a legal codifier, what he did was unbelievable. And he literally has contained the entire Talmud in his hands. He's holding it so well to truly, truly be able to then reconstruct it in this format. There was a very brilliant scholar, a very brilliant rabbi, that he passed away right before the Holocaust, like literally passed away in 1939 in Latvia. He was brilliant, brilliant, brilliant mind, called the Ragachover. And he searched and searched for a teacher for his brilliant mind, and he couldn't find anyone. It says he went all the way back to Maimonides. And when he was studying the works of Maimonides, he's like, this is my teacher. And he would literally carry around a book of Maimonides, whatever book he was currently studying, and he'd refer to it as my teacher, the person that shone forth through the book. Because to this brilliant, brilliant, brilliant mind, this was the only mind he found that he could view as his teacher. So he was also, Maimonides was also a philosopher, and he wrote philosophical works, many philosophical works. He was also a leader of the Jews of his times, obviously, and he wrote many works to answer the struggles the Jews were having at that time, even though, generally speaking, the Jews under the Islamic regimes had it much, much, much easier than under the Christians, for sure, no question. But there were times where there was very fanatical Islamic forces that took over, did what we would call jihad. They called it then jihad. These wars for God, where basically they wanted to convert or kill everyone. So basically, like as the Christians did. So Maimonides lived during this time in the Islamic world. So a lot of the Jews at that time were really suffering and suffering from the persecution, the Islamic persecution, and really needed a lot of fortification to stay strong and not succumb. So there's many letters that Maimonides writes to communities, comforting them and strengthening them and giving them philosophical and moral and spiritual things to lean on to stay strong in the face of all this opposition and pressure that they were experiencing. On the side, he was also the leading physician of his time, and he was the personal doctor of the Sultan of Egypt. But that was truly on the side, because his primary job was to lead the Jewish people, to be this codifier of law, to be this philosopher, to be this commentator, and truly, even as just like the introduction to his magnum opus of 14 volumes, he first says, well, if I'm going to explain all the laws, you need to know what the commandments are. So he just, like, as an introduction, writes this amazing work in which he codifies all 613 commandments. And that was just like the introduction. So this was an unbelievable pen of an unbelievable genius that really was a major, major beacon of light for the Jews then, continuing until today. Lubavitcher Rebbe holds very strongly of Maimonides, and really, when he speaks of him as, like we would say, a Rebbe status, someone on that level of a leader of the world and connecting the world to God. So we have the first one, the Rif. Then we have Maimonides, and I mentioned the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe holds very much from how Maimonides codified the laws. Again, this was written, when was it written? Towards the end of his lifetime. And we said he passed away in 1204. So it was written at some point in the 12th century, right? Now we're quite later, and yet the Lubavitcher Rebbe encourages every person to learn daily this entire pieces, obviously, of this entire codification system. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe set up a cycle that if a person learns 3 chapters a day, they finish it in a little less than a year. Or if they learn 1 chapter a day, they finish it in approximately 3 years. And for people that can't even do that, then they have a daily portion of Maimonides' codification of the commandments to learn in sync with wherever they're holding in the 1 chapter a day study portion. So this is amazing that here the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we're talking about how many years later, right? 700 some years later, is saying this is so vital. Every single person should learn something of this every single day, and every single person should have a study cycle in place to complete this on a regular, ideally annual basis. So one advantage of Maimonides over the Rif who came before him and the Rosh, we didn't mention yet, who came after him, is that he codified everything. Meaning the other codifiers excluded anything that was not relevant to the Jews at that time. So anything that has to do with the redemption, Mashiach, they didn't bother with at all. Anything that has to do with the temple, anything that was only allowed, and any laws that only were applicable during the times of the temple or when the majority of the Jews are in Israel, they didn't write at all. They were only focused on the laws the Jew needs today in exile. And Maimonides says, I'm giving you everything. This is forever. This is also for the times of the redemption. I want you to know every law just from me. So that was Maimonides. The scholar that also tremendously impacted the ability of a regular Jew to serve God was called the Rosh. That was his name. That was his acronym. His name was Usher, the son of Yechiel. These was the days before last names. So people were identified by their fathers. Like Maimonides was Moses, Moshe, the son of Maimon. That has become called Maimonides. That was Maimon was his father. So the Rosh, Usher, the son of Yechiel, he lived from 1250 to 1327. So you see, Maimonides passed away in 1204, and some 50 years later, this next great luminary is born, the Rosh, Usher ben Yechiel, Rabbeinu Usher, which in short becomes Rosh. He was an eminent rabbi and a Talmudist, and he wrote an abstract of Talmudic law with only the final practical law. So now we have these three great rabbis that were all confronting the same problem, again, at different points. Remember, the Talmud was closed in 500 and really closed 100 years later in the year 600. The first one, Rabbi Yitzhak Alfassi, is writing in about the year 1100. So we're about 500 years later. Already at that time, 500 years later, they didn't know how to function. And he wrote his work to help. After his passing, Maimonides is born like some 30 years later, 30 years after this prior rabbi passed away. Maimonides is like, this is not helpful enough. His work is still so cumbersome. His work is still so hard to follow because it's following the very loose structure of the Talmud. That's not very efficient if you just want to find the law. So he completely restructured it. And then he passed away in 1204. The next rabbi, the Rosh, was born about 50 years later in 1250, and he wrote his version of it. He, like the Rif, followed the structure of the Talmud, unlike Maimonides, who created his own completely independent structure. Maimonides was very, very controversial. Nowadays, we're 800 years later, and of course, everyone accepts Maimonides, and everyone accepts the truth of Maimonides. Like many great leaders, their light is a little too shining, too brilliant for the people of their times. So even though, of course, there were many, many, many adherents of Maimonides, but there are also many people that it was like too radical. It was just too radical for them. And it didn't feel safe because it's like totally new, like he's totally leaving the structure of the Talmud. He's totally reconstructing it. He's not telling you any of the sources. So you're like, well, how do I know? I'm just trusting blindly Maimonides. Like, you go on a GPS and it's like hard because you just have to trust this GPS that the GPS knows what it's talking about. That's what I feel sometimes. So you just have to trust Maimonides because Maimonides is not giving you any leg to stand on. He's not giving you any source, any reference. He's just crunching it all down and reconstructing it in the most simple fashion where all there is law. Just law. Where he got it from, you got to trust him, that he got it straight from the Talmud, and you don't know his sources, you got to trust him. So not everybody felt so trusting. And that's why the Rosh, even though his work sort of almost goes backwards, more along the style of the Rif, but was more traditional in its approach, and so people that weren't comfortable with Maimonides were comfortable with the Rosh. All three of them tremendously impacted Jewish scholarship and, more significantly, Jewish life, because they made the Talmud user-friendly. They made knowledge of the law attainable. Each of them could be studied alone, meaning you just study Maimonides. As I said, Lubavitcher Rebbe instituted that we should study Maimonides, not in conjunction to Talmud, which would be very difficult actually, as versus the Rosh and the Rif, that's more directly matching with the Talmud. Maimonides is like its whole separate work. So you just study the Maimonides and you know exactly how to live. Or study Maimonides as a guide to studying the Talmud and knowing exactly what the Talmud is trying to say. And the Rif and the Rosh are very often, their work is actually printed side by side within the structure of the Talmud itself. So literally you see the Talmud and you see the Rif and you see the Rosh, and you know exactly what are the laws we're supposed to extract from this folio, from this page of Talmud. Any questions on any of that?
Mr. Searle, I was just curious, what do you study Maimonides, or do you study the Rif and the Rosh, or do you study all three?
No, just Maimonides.
Gotcha.
But again, because I'm studying in a sense of knowing what to do, and the Rif and the Rosh is more people that study it, that are studying the Talmud directly as Talmud. Now, let me actually, what you're raising is something that I actually should have mentioned. The Rif, the Rosh, and Maimonides all have the same goal. We want you to be able to live a godly life and know how to do it.
Right.
Their goal, none of them had the goal to, how should I put it? Their goal wasn't to show their brilliance in Talmudic thought. So there are many rabbis till today that study the Talmud all day and all night. And they're brilliant minds of like, in this ocean of Talmudic thought. And they can, I don't know if I'm explaining clearly, but they can like pull a piece from here and a piece from here and show all this insight and depth and what this line meant and all of this analysis and synthesis and brilliance. And there are scholars that study the Talmud day and night till today. But those people aren't studying it to know if the chicken's kosher or not.
Right.
They're not studying it to know how you write a mezuzah and who should write a mezuzah and what a mezuzah should be written and what is the appropriate quill and where do you put a mezuzah and how do you slant the mezuzah and which door needs a mezuzah and when you make the blessing and what the blessing is. They're not studying it for the how-to of Judaism. They're studying it for the study of Torah, to immerse their minds in the sea of Torah. But the Rif, the Rosh, and the Maimonides are all saying this is also supposed to be how you live a Jewish life. And you can get so carried away in that ocean of Torah, but bottom line, how do you write a mezuzah? So that's what they did. So if somebody was interested in studying Talmud for the sake of Talmud, they wouldn't necessarily use any of these three.
Awesome.
Because that's not really their point. But if someone is studying to know what should I do, the Rif and the Rosh more are in sync with the Talmud, but telling you more or less the laws. And Maimonides is definitely the clearest and most comprehensive, explaining all the laws as he culled them from the Talmud. So that's why Maimonides has a very distinct advantage over the other two. And in his very radical work of completely stepping away from the Talmud and making a whole new structure, whole new way of doing it, like, because the Talmud is very like, it flows from one conversation to another, from one topic to another, from one verse to another. And Maimonides says, that's beautiful for Talmudic study. But if you want to know what to do, we don't want it to flow. We want to be like an engineer.
Right.
And that's how he wrote his work.
You know, my thought process is that, you know, there's a lot of that, obviously, that is specific to just the Jewish people. However, I can imagine that there are pieces of the Talmud that are, you know, how to be a good human being, and
Absolutely.
those would apply to all of us.
And also, all the laws of Noahides that we get primarily come from Maimonides.
Ah.
Meaning, the book I use that book on, that thick book, The Divine Code, that
Mhm.
we've studied in this class, the sources very, very often is Maimonides, because Maimonides took the Talmud, but he made it very clear because he just pulled out the law. So throughout the Talmud, there's scattered little bits and pieces about Noahides, but it's like a little bit scattered here, and then a little bit here, and a little bit here, and a little bit here, and it's very scattered. So Maimonides, in culling everything, also culled those laws. So when we learned those fundamental chapters on a Noahide, which we did one class, I think for like 2 classes, what we were learning was Maimonides. In his work, Mishnah Torah, this work I'm talking about, this magnum opus of his, just the same way he culled all the laws of Sabbath and all the laws of mezuzah and all the laws of phylacteries of tefillin, he culled the laws of the Noahides, which absolutely comes from the Talmud, but he just made it much more user-friendly. Now, even though all 3 of these great beacons of light tried to make it user-friendly, again, as time goes on, we need it simpler. It's just this progression. It's like you think as time goes on, the Excel should get easier, but it just got harder and harder and harder. More and more pressures, more and more stress, more and more persecution, and less time for people to just sit and study. And maybe it's also part of just the economic realities of lives and the economic pressures in these places where there was so much persecution of the Jewish people, and therefore it was so hard for them to put bread on the table. So when you're in such a situation, how do you study? When do you study? And who has the luxury of studying? Obviously, there always were people that did. But again, as time goes on, the enormous clarity that the Rosh, that the Rif and Maimonides and the Rosh added, it wasn't clear enough. It's just people needed it simpler. I mean, think of nowadays, right? You just want to say, Google, how do I show me, is this chicken kosher or not? Dr. Google. That's what we came to today. But this was a process of many years. So the next major development in rabbinic literature was written by someone who lived from 1270 to 1340. So again, he lived very parallel to the Rosh, right? The Rosh was 1250 to 1327. So he's a little bit later. The Rosh was born in 1250. He was born in 1270. The Rosh passed away in 1327. He passed away in 1340. So it's just 13 years later. But so the next major development wasn't 100 years later, even 50 years later, because he passed away 13 years after the Rosh. But he created a very important halachic means legal code, called the Turin. A Tur means like a line, but the 4 Turim, or a Tur, the Arba Turim. His name was Yaakov, the son of Asher, and he's called the Baal HaTurim, the master of the Turim, because his work was called the Turim. He was a legal scholar. He was also a biblical commentator, meaning if you would see a Bible, a Torah, not in all of them, but in some of them, he's there as a commentator on the works. So what did he do that was the next development as versus Maimonides or the Rosh or the Rif? So the Rosh, the Rif, and Maimonides were all looking at the Talmud and saying, how do we cull what you need to do, the laws from the Talmud? So they were still very connected to the Talmud. The Rosh and the Rif were really writing literally that they're on the same page as the Talmud. And Maimonides creating his whole new structure. But as I said, Maimonides was, at least in the beginning, quite controversial because he was so radical. So what the Tur did was he even took a step further away from the Talmud. He made a 4-part legal code in which he, in a sense like Maimonides, said, we can't even follow the structure of the Talmud anymore. Too complicated for us. I'm rewriting this completely. It is the foundation. It was the foundation, the standard legal code for all Jews followed it until the Code of Jewish Law, which was written in 1560. So that's 220 years after he passed away. So for 200 plus years, his work, which we call the Torah, this was the go-to of how do you live as a Jew, meaning the Rif and Maimonides and the Rosh were already too complicated. We need it simpler. So he made it even simpler than they did. And what he did was the standard for over 200 years of like how to live as a Jew. You don't go to the Rif or the Rosh. That's way too complicated. That's way too closely adhering to the Talmud. You could go to Maimonides, but he's got a lot. We want something even more simplified, even more streamlined. Let's go to the Torah. So for over 200 years, that work called the Torah was the foundation of Jewish law. How do I live? That was in the Torah. It was actually printed. The Torahs, meaning shortly after the invention of the printing press, the first Jewish word printed, of course, was the Torah. But after that, the Torah was printed. It was printed in 1475, which was shortly after the invention of the printing press. And it was the most popular work printed in the 15th century. What do I mean by the most popular work? Those copies were made because every Jew in the entire Jewish world, and there's no such thing as a non-religious Jew in those days. You followed the law or you weren't Jewish. You know, if you just assimilated, you just didn't view yourself as Jewish at all. So every single Jew was a religious Jew, all the millions of Jews that lived then. And every single one, obviously in those days, a person didn't own their own set. A community owned, or maybe in a large community, there were a few sets, maybe for a school of training, you know, the next Jewish scholars. It wasn't like people had them in their bookshelves like Dixie has, or I might have. But every community needed a Torah. Every rabbi needed a Torah. Every school of Jewish thought needed a Torah, because that was how you knew how to. That was the simplest way. Of course, the rabbis also studied the Talmud and they also studied Maimonides, but just simply to be able to, in very clear, simple way, know how to live, he went for the Torah. So it's an amazing thing that this work lasted for over 200 years as the guide of how to live. And it was accepted by the entire Jewish world, meaning in the Jewish world, we have broadly divided into two groups: Ashkenazic Jews, which are Jews that come from Germany, Russia, Poland, England, France, all those are Ashkenazic countries. And then Sephardic Jews that are North Africa, the Middle East, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Rome, all those countries around the Mediterranean, those are all Sephardic Jews. But the Torah was the same for everyone. Everyone followed it. That was what was, you know. So everyone used it, and it was amazing. And again, what he did was he moved a step past the Rif, the Rosh, and Maimonides, because he just further simplified it. He moved a step away. Again, he moved completely away from the structure of the Talmud. And basically, as I said, it was 4 sections. So he created 4 sections dealing with different categories of laws. So you just learn the law directly from his work, completely independent of the Talmud. He basically followed, you could say, the structure of Maimonides, meaning remember the Rif and the Rosh adhere to the Talmudic structure, which is why I said they're on the pages. They're very often, a Talmud has on that page the Rif and the Rosh, because they're following the structure of the Talmud. Maimonides completely left the structure of the Talmud. He said, this is way too complicated, way too confusing, way too not user-friendly. I've got to make something that just is systematic and methodical. That was what Maimonides did. So the Torah, Yaakov, the son of Asher, he followed the same approach of Maimonides, and he basically is following Maimonides' footsteps, but he's saying, Maimonides, you gave us 14 volumes. That's a lot of laws. I got to make it smaller. I got to make it less cumbersome. A person, it's just a lot. Again, it's good for a rabbi, it's good for a scholar, but I want to speak for the layman. I got to make it less. They don't need to know every little nuance of law. They got to know what's like applicable for them. So he followed Maimonides' approach, but he simplified it because he said Maimonides is too bulky for just common use. Now, again, remember, I told you one of the reasons Maimonides is so bulky is because he codified everything. So when the Tur did his work, he took Maimonides, but he like cut it. So everything Maimonides wrote, I told you, if you remember, what was unique about Maimonides is that he wrote laws that are not applicable for that time in exile. He wrote laws that are only will be applicable by the redemption. He wrote laws that are only applicable in the times of the temple, only applicable when all the Jews live in Israel. All those laws, the Torah cut. Like, it's true, it's good, and it's great for the scholars to know. But for the layman, it's too many pages. We don't want it. We're cutting just to make it as simplified, as small, as user-friendly as possible. Besides cutting from Maimonides the stuff that he said are not applicable nowadays, which was a big innovation of Maimonides as versus the Rosh and the Rif that also did not comment on anything that was not applicable. He also, the Torah added customs he saw in various countries. Meaning Maimonides, as the Rif and the Rosh, are just writing straight from the Talmud. So they're not putting in any personal insight based on how Jews are actually observing the law today, the day when Maimonides or the Rif or the Rosh are writing. They are just culling from the Talmud. The Torah added, he took away a lot from Maimonides, but he also added how it's being practiced today. And he traveled, so in the various countries, he wrote, in this country, in this one group of people, he also wrote, he was the first one that commented on the idea of the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazic practice. Remember, I said he's accepted by all Jews for over 200 years, because in his work, he would write, Sephardim do it like this, and Ashkenazim do it like this. Sephardim do it like this, and Ashkenazim do it like this. Maimonides doesn't mention the word Sephardim or Ashkenazim. He's just pulling straight Talmud. So in the Talmud, there's no, Sephardim and Ashkenazim hadn't existed yet. So nowhere in Maimonides do we hear the concept of Sephardim versus Ashkenazim. Nowhere in Maimonides does he discuss nowadays how people are doing this law differently. But the Torah does that. So he made it, again, he followed Maimonides' structure, but he cut all the stuff he felt wasn't needed for whatever reason. He tried to make it as small as possible, and then he added customs and differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. So that was a great simplification, and he was universally followed for over 200 years. Then, so that was like, whoa, into the 1500s, which is amazing. And that lasted until 1560. Now, 1560, what came on the scene? In 1560, the thought was, the Torah is amazing. It's been the light for Jews for 200 years, but the minds are getting smaller. The ability to study is getting smaller. The concentration is getting smaller. We need something simpler. And that simpler became the Code of Jewish Law, which was written in 1560. It was written by a great genius and very godly person named Rabbi Yosef Cairo. This is right, we have last names. Rabbi Yosef Cairo. He followed the structure of the Torah, meaning those four bodies that the Torah created, he followed, but he didn't follow the content of the Torah. He went back to the sources meaning the Rif, the Rosh, and Maimonides. So again, he didn't do straight Talmud, he more followed, but he used a bit of all. He followed in some things he brought from the Rif, some things he brought from the Rosh, and some things he brought from Maimonides. He's following the structure of the Torah, which people are familiar with. They've been learning this way for 200 years, but he brought in more from the Rif, the Rosh, and Maimonides than from the Torah itself. Now Rabbi Yosef Cairo was Sephardic. He was Cairo from Egypt. So everything he's writing, he writes as the Sephardim determined law. So a great sage who was a contemporary of his, who was Ashkenazic, a great rabbi. His name was Moshe Isserles. Now, he called his the Shulchan Aruch. I didn't translate for you. Shulchan Aruch means the set table. It was so simplified, like, whoa, suddenly like Torah becomes so simple, but it was all the Sephardic way of doing it. So for Ashkenazic Jews that live in England or France or Germany or Poland or Russia, what they're reading, that's not their laws. So Rav Moshe Isserles, he created what he called the mappa. Mappa means a tablecloth. So he said, Rabbi Yosef Cairo made the table. I'm making the tablecloth over the table. What he meant was, in any place where Ashkenazic Jewish rabbis hold differently than the Sephardic rabbis, he's going to write how it's done in the Ashkenazic way. So an Ashkenazi person studying this work called the Shulchan Aruch, which we would literally means a set table, but loosely it's translated as the code of Jewish law. On the side, you have Reb Moshe Isserles's, who's in brief is called the Ramah. Reb Moshe Isserles's comments anytime Ashkenazic practice is different. So therefore, a Sephardic person can learn it straight. Yes, this is what he follows. And an Ashkenazic person can learn it, and then he sees, the emendations on how a Ashkenazic person would do it differently. That was the final humongous demarcation line in simplifying Jewish law, simplifying the ability, not changing the law. When I say simplifying Jewish law, we're talking about literature, biblical literature, rabbinic literature, not simplifying the laws, God forbid, but simplifying our accessibility to the laws. Because again, just as the Torah said, again, right? Think of how it went. In the times of the Mishnah, which was written in the year 200, they were like, oh my gosh, we're going to forget everything. We got to write it. And they wrote it very briefly because we don't really want to write this. We got to write this. Some 300 years later, it's like, we don't understand this. So we have the whole Talmudic literature to explain it. And that lasted for about 500 years. And then the Rif is like, a Jew can't live off the Talmud. It's too cumbersome. It's too complex. And then Maimonides comes along and he says, you can't understand from the Rif either because he's too tied into the logic to the structure of the Talmud. So again, how are you gonna find out if your chicken's kosher or not? How are you gonna find out how you're gonna write your mezuzah? How are you gonna find out how you get dressed in the morning? We can't follow a Talmud, which the Rif is doing. I gotta make a totally new structure. Just systematic, organized, forget about the Talmud. The Talmud is brilliant. I'm taking all the laws of the Talmud. I'm not forgetting about the Talmud. That was the wrong way to put it. I'm taking all the laws of the Talmud, but I'm creating a totally new structure because the structure of the Talmud is not user-friendly. The Rosh sort of goes back to the Rif, following the structure of the Talmud. So Maimonides is much simpler, but again, it's quite large, 14 massive volumes. Comes along the Torah, and he's like, 14 volumes, Maimonides. You can't ask a regular Jew to study and absorb 14 volumes. The Lubavitch Rebbe asked us to study and absorb these 14 volumes. Forget it. We got to make it a lot smaller. We're going to cut away as much as we can, simplify as much as we can. The rabbis, the big rabbis, they'll study you. They'll study the Talmud directly. They'll know everything. Those are the big rabbis. But the little rabbis, let's give them the Torah so that they could just be a rabbi and know how to lead their flock. And if you need to have a bigger question, they'll go to a bigger rabbi that studied the whole Maimonides, that studied the whole Rif, that studied the whole Rosh, that studied the whole Talmud. But for the little rabbis, we need a Torah. And that lasted 200 years. And I'm saying that lasted until 1560, when Rabbi Yosef Cairo was like, the little rabbis, a Torah is too complicated. And for sure, the layman, a Torah is way too complicated. A rabbi should be able to handle a Torah. But a layman, for sure, a Torah is way too complicated. We want the layman to study law. We want the layman to be masters of law. We can't give them a Torah. That's way too complicated. So we're going to give them a Shulchan Aruch. Again, it means like a set table. I made it so easy. It's all set. Just come sit down and enjoy. So with a Shulchan Aruch, a little rabbi can be an expert of Jewish law. A layman can be an expert of Jewish law. And especially when Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, put the tablecloth over it, telling Ashkenazic Jews how they do it differently. Any little rabbi, little community, little rabbi could be a master of Jewish law. Any layman could study Jewish law. We made it so user-friendly. Now that was so user-friendly in 1560. We're in 2021. So obviously, not too many Jews nowadays, besides the scholars, would consider the original Shulchan Aruch, the original set table of 1560, as super user-friendly, because we're 500 years slower, not as smart. I don't want to say anything negative, but like our minds are small. You know, I don't know what they say, and the average person uses like 3-point-something% of their brains. So we got really, really small minds and really distracted. We're not just an ADD, we're all ADD on one way or another. And if we're not, our phones definitely are making us that way. So very, very few people besides rabbis really study from the original Shulchan Aruch, the original set table of Rabbi Yosef Cairo. But since he wrote that, there have been countless people, countless great rabbis after him that wrote their own version of that set table, of that guide to Jewish law, code to Jewish law. Again, literally it's translated as Shulchan Aruch set table, but I think loosely it'd be translated as code of Jewish law. The Alter Rebbe, who wrote the Tanya, that we've studied some parts of it, he wrote his code of Jewish law. There's many different codes of Jewish laws that are written today. And then people wrote, there was a rabbi in, I don't remember when, like the late 1800s, that wrote the abridged version of the code of Jewish law to make it shorter. Again, so we're cutting out a lot of the laws, right? And the rabbis need to know them, and the rabbis will guide the flock. But for the regular person who just wants to open up a book and see if he knows the answer himself, it's a shorter book and it's an easier book. So do the code of Jewish law, the abridged version of the code of Jewish law. And of course, nowadays, everything's written in every language. All of these works were, of course, written in Hebrew. Loads, not just translated to English, written originally in English, written in countless languages, translated to countless languages, things written to make it as user-friendly as possible. So if I would pick up, I try to learn Jewish law every single day. I do study Maimonides every day, but that's more for the spiritual reasoning of it as being like this spiritual repository of all law. But I also every day study law. I study the laws as they're written by the rabbis within the past, 20 years. Again, the laws aren't different. They're not, God forbid, changing any of the laws all the way back to the Talmud. It's the same laws, but it's written in the language and with the examples and with pictures and diagrams to make it what we call user-friendly. And it could be even simpler than this. So the goal was always the same. We want the person to be able to learn, study, and understand. And of course, there's more and more levels of complex and broad-ranging works. And the greater the Torah authority, the more of those he has to master. But for the simple person that just wants to know how to live, we want to make it as simplified as possible. Now, I had mentioned that all of these writings, meaning everything that I mentioned last class on this and today, every one of these people, we view their writings as the divine spirit. All of them use their minds. All of them studied with their minds and delved with their minds and worked very hard with their minds to understand. But what came out of their minds was God's divine spirit. Because if you remember, I told you that until the time of the Shach and the Taz, which was in the 1660s, which is way after this, because the code of Jewish law I'm talking about, the original Shulchan Aruch, was printed in 1560. So everything we've said, the Rif, the Rosh, Maimonides, the Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, the Mappa, the tablecloth over it, all of that was a divine spirit, because the Taz and the Shach lived till 1663. And everything until this time we view as divine spirit. I wouldn't say straight from God, using your mind, and then what comes out is straight from God. Now, who was the Taz and the Shach that we even mentioned them as like the demarcation lines? They were major commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, on this code of Jewish law, on this set table. The Shach is a major commentator on remember there's 4 sections, because the Torah created this idea of these 4 sections, and the Shulchan Aruch, the code of law, even though it relied heavily on his predecessors, Maimonides, the Rosh, and the Rif, but it followed the structure of the Torah. So the Shach, who is about 100 years after the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, he is a major commentator on 2 out of those 4 sections. And he and all that preceded him that are writing rabbinic literature, we view it all as writing with the divine spirit. So someone today that writes, obviously someone's writing law, they're just taking the law and chewing it down and making it easier to understand. But if someone who's innovating something today, we don't know if it was necessarily the divine spirit. It might just be his own godly and brilliant thoughts. But until the Shach and the Taz, maybe until the late 1600s, it's all divine spirit. Now the Tanya, which is a work that I've mentioned, which is the primary philosophical guide of the Chabad Hasidic movement, of the Lubavitch movement, written by the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement. That was written 100 years later. That was written in the 1700s, the late 1700s. So that's 100 years after we say everything was just pure divine spirit. And that's why we would view the Tanya as a combination of the brilliant godly mind of the author, what we call the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shner Zalman of Liadi, and divine spirit. But that's why we view it that way, because of its enormous godliness. But it's possible in those days someone could have written something that would be just their mind, brilliant mind, godly mind, but just their mind. But anything I've discussed last class and today, all of that we view as godly, holy, divine spirit, using the human mind, but ultimately what came out was straight from God himself. And that was answering Christelle's question. So she didn't realize what a complex question it was. But it wasn't a simple question, but I felt it was a good question that deserved a real answer. I could have said it in 10 minutes maybe, but then it wouldn't have been a real answer. So any questions on any of this?
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you so much. I learned a lot. So that was very interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. My pleasure. So please feel free to either post on our WhatsApp group questions, or to funnel them directly to Danielle, who then gets them to me, because definitely I'd love to structure the class based on your questions. And if anything wasn't clear that you want to ask, you can always either ask me directly or put it on the group. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you,
I
Cyril.
appreciate it. It's late.
Thank
You have a
you.
lot to do. So it's so nice when people prioritize studying
you.
about God.
Good night.
Good night.